77 The teachings of the Lord of the Second Coming. 2.5 The parallel periods determined by the number of generations. According to the Bible, God chose Noah to shoulder the providence. 10 generations and 1600 years after Adam. Let us examine what significant numbers were restored by the 1600 years. And the 10 generations. The number 10 is the number of unity with God. The course of growth to maturity requires a period to fulfill the number 10, through which Adam and Eve were to become the perfect embodiments of the number 10. When this number was defiled by Satan due to their fall, God sought a central figure in order to restore this number, and begin his work to unite the people with himself by restoring them as perfect embodiments of the quality of the number 10. For this purpose, God would require the central figure to complete an indemnity period to restore the number 10. This is why God called Noah 10 generations after Adam. It was discussed earlier that the first human ancestors were to pass through a course to maturity, which fulfilled the number 40 and thereby become perfect embodiments of the number 40. For fallen people to become the central figures, who will pave the way for the restoration of perfect embodiments of the number 40. They must establish the four-position foundation necessary for restoration, and then fulfill an indemnity period to restore the number 40. Each position of the four-position foundation should fulfill the indemnity period to restore the number 40, yielding an indemnity period to restore the number 160. Moreover, since fallen people were to fulfill this number through 10 generations 10, signifying unity with God, he had to complete an indemnity period of the number 1600. This is the reason the period from Adam to Noah was 1600 years, by biblical reckoning. After the failure of the providence of restoration in Noah's family, God waited 400 years until another 10 generations had elapsed before calling Abraham to carry the burden of the providence, set according to the number of generations. The period from Noah to Abraham was parallel to the period from Adam to Noah, and was to restore that earlier period through indemnity. It was discussed earlier why this period was made 400 years. 7 God had Noah endure the 40-day flood judgment for the purpose of accomplishing the goal of the providence of restoration, which he had pursued by setting up the 10 generations and 1600 years. When this 40-day flood judgment was defiled by Satan due to Ham's mistake, God had to work through another central figure to restore it. From Adam to Noah, God worked to fulfill indemnity periods to restore the number 160 in each of 10 generations. In the parallel period of 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, God set each generation as the indemnity period to restore the number 40, which is derived from the flood judgment. The failure of the 40-day flood judgment had to be restored through a period of the number 40. Since the restoration of each subsequent generation had to span its entire length, it could not be fulfilled in only 40 days. Hence, God set the indemnity period to be fulfilled by each generation as 40 years. A day of the flood was indemnified by a year, just as in Moses' time. When the failure of the 40-day mission to spy out the land was restored through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 8 Since the dispensation in which each generation was set as a 40-year indemnity period continued through 10 generations, the entire span of the indemnity period came to be 400 years. 2.6 Providential periods of horizontal restoration through indemnity, carried out vertically. As explained earlier, each central figure of the providence is called to restore horizontally all the vertical indemnity conditions accumulated up to his time. Hence, the longer providential history is prolonged, the heavier the indemnity conditions will be for the central figures of later generations to fulfill horizontally. In the providence of restoration in Adam's family, there were as yet no vertical indemnity conditions because the providence had just begun. Therefore, the foundation for the Messiah could have been laid quite simply by Cain and Abel properly making the symbolic offerings and the substantial offering. It would have merely required that once Abel had made his offering in a manner acceptable to God, Cain should have obeyed and followed Abel to fulfill the indemnity condition, to remove the fallen nature. In regard to the numerical indemnity periods to restore the foundation of faith, these could have been completed in the short time necessary for making the symbolic and substantial offerings. However, when the providence of restoration was prolonged due to the failure of Adam's family, vertical indemnity conditions began to accumulate in the form of various numerical indemnity periods. Therefore, in restoring the foundation of faith, the central figures since Adam's day have had to complete numerical indemnity periods to restore such numbers as 12, 4, 21 and 40. In the case of Noah, he was supposed to restore in his time all of these vertical indemnity conditions. To restore the foundation of faith, he had to go through several numerical indemnity periods. 120 years to build the ark, 40 days of the flood judgment. 21 days during which he sent out the dove 3 times at 7-day intervals. And the 40-day period from the time the ark came to rest on Mt. Ararat until he sent out the dove. Noah faithfully fulfilled these numerical indemnity periods. But due to Ham's mistake they were invaded by Satan. Consequently, they were again left behind. As vertical indemnity conditions, Abraham had the opportunity to restore them all at once, through his symbolic offering. However, because Abraham failed in his offering, the indemnity periods could not be restored horizontally. They then had to be restored vertically. By prolonging the fulfillment of his will through Isaac and Jacob, God worked to fulfill in succession indemnity periods to restore the numbers 12, 4, 21 and 40. In the providence in Abraham's family, the following indemnity periods, which should have been fulfilled horizontally, were instead carried out in vertical succession to restore the foundation of faith. 120 years from the time Abraham left Haran, until Jacob purchased the birthright from Esau with bread and a pottage of lentils. 40 years from that time, until Jacob was given the blessing of the eldest son by his father Isaac and received God's blessing on his way to Haran. 21 years from that time, until he completed his toil in Haran and returned to Canaan with his family and wealth. 10 and 40 years from the time Jacob returned to Canaan until his family entered Egypt at Joseph's invitation. In this way, the indemnity conditions, which could not be restored horizontally, were completed as extended vertical periods of fixed lengths.